All right, hello everybody. It's been a little while since I've streamed philosophy research because it's been a little while since I've read anything I've been writing. But we're back at it with this chapter from the book Derek Parfit's Reasons and Perfect Persons, edited by Andreas Sarcelli. And this is Transformative Choice and the Non-Identity Problem by Nilanjan and L.A. Paul. Some of our acts change who we are. Call them personally transformative acts. Already there's something to do because I think I have in my glossary here somewhere. Whoops. Transformative experiences. Where is this? It's in epistemology. Yeah, oh, I guess it's because we can't know what's on the other side. So but actually I also have this thing called transfiguration. Reorganizes a person to track different properties. Well, okay, we're not going to put this in as a term yet. We're gonna think about it. When an agent performs a personally transformative act, she brings into existence a future self that's radically different from who she previously was. In some of these cases, the agent may be anti-signally certain that the existence of this future self, though worth having, will be unavoidably flawed even if the future self values its existence. If the agent doesn't perform the transformative act, she won't change so radically, so her unchanged self may do a bit better off in the future than her transformed future self. In this chapter, we argue that a situation of this kind raises a problem that's structurally similar to the non-identity problem. And I can click on this, right? Yes. The earliest discussions occurred in Iverson, Kafka, Parfait, C. McMahon, Benevitz. I want to open up I read this a while ago because I taught it in a class. So this is 2021 after the book, and does she cite? Sorry, who wrote? Yeah, Nilanjan Das. No, it's not cited here. Nor is any L.A. Paul stuff. Okay. And clicking this endnote does not go back to the beginning, which is terrible, which means we're going to have 2 copies of this thing open. So we're going to open containing folder and copy and go to the desktop and paste and open up the duplicate copy, and scroll down. To here and move this over. Okay. Here's the plan for this chapter. We begin by explaining what we mean by personally transformative acts. We argue that transformative acts involve the creation of selves that wouldn't otherwise exist. Then we show how 2 plausible principles about prudence raise a problem analogous to the non-identity problem with respect to transformative acts. Finally, we consider some responses to the problem. In our discussion, we've attempted to preserve the structure of Parfit's original argument while discussing human lives in a way that doesn't make egregious assumptions about their values. Value. In recent work on transformative experience, Paul distinguishes 2 kinds of transformative experience. Some are epistemically transformative. Before undergoing these experiences, the agent doesn't know what it would be like to undergo. Okay, so my term is not full enough. It shouldn't be called transformative experience. It should be called epistemically transformative. So it might, maybe nesting it under epistemology is not the right way. But where else do I nest it? Three and 4. Ostrovsky. Cases of this kind can be treated analogous to the case of Mary Jackson. This in turn raises the interesting question of what the relevant kind of epistemic transformation consists in. Following the different use a mere example, you could flesh it out in terms of acquisition of a certain phenomenal concepts, or the acquisition of certain cognitive skills, or in terms of the acquisition of self-locating information. Some experiences are also personally transformative. Also, I wonder if that means all personally transformative ones are epistemically transformative. I don't think it's supposed to be implied, although it sort of sounds like that. They change the core beliefs, desires, the who the agent is. And this what happens if I merge with term? I don't want that, but this sounds dangerously close to where's that thing? Transfiguration. But this doesn't actually look like it's talking about numerical identity. Oh, here we go. I don't know, let's see. Examples include experiencing a horrific physical attack, gaining a new sensory ability, having a traumatic accident, undergoing major surgery, winning an Olympic gold medal, participating in a revolution, having a religious conversion, having a good child, experiencing the death of a parent, making a major scientific discovery, or experiencing the death of a child. There are two ways of framing such personal transformations. One could take the third-person approach to them, like Edna and Marguerite. She considers situations where an agent must decide among certain options, at least one of which by her own lights will change her personality, and calls the decision made in such scenarios opting. As Alman Marguerite describes it, if a person goes for personality-changing option in such scenarios, a new person comes into existence. A new person is, by hypothesis, a transformed person. Opting transforms a set of one's core beliefs and desires. A significant personality shift takes place in our opter, a shift that alters his cognitive as well as evaluative systems. New person's new set of beliefs and desires may well be internally consistent, but the point about transformation is that inconsistency now exists between new person's system of beliefs and desires taken as a whole and old person's system taken as a whole. She goes on to illustrate the idea with the following example. I was told the person who hesitated to have children because he didn't want to become the boring type that all his friends had become after they had children. Finally, he did decide to have a child, and with time he did adopt boring old characteristics of a parent friends, but he was happy. I suppose second order preferences are crucial to the way we are to make sense of this story. As old person, he did not approve the personality he knew he would become if he has children. His preferences were not to have the new person's preferences. As new person, however, not only did he acquire the predicted set of preferences, he also seems to have approved of himself having them. In this case, new person differs from old person not only with respect to her first person preferences about what to do in particular situations, about whether to stay out late or come home early, but also with respect to her second order preferences about which first order preferences to have. When an agent undergoes a personal transformation, both her first and second order preferences change in tandem. This is a purely third personal way of characterizing personally transformative experiences. In contrast, Paul characterizes personally transformative experiences by highlighting the first personally accessible changes. One of his examples is this. The cat is playing at my feet. Imagine you'll have a chance to become a vampire. With one swift, painless bite, you'll be permanently transformed into an elegant and fabulous creature of the night. As a member of the undead, your life will be completely different. You'll experience a range of intense revelatory new sense experiences. You'll gain moral strength, speed, and power, and you'll look fantastic in everything you wear. You also need to drink blood and avoid sunlight. On this view, when you become a vampire, the phenomenal character of your lived experience is, that is what it's like for you to undergo those experiences will change. These changes may be connected to the changes in one's preferences. Assuming that our preferences are sensitive to some extent to the phenomenal character of our experiences, radical changes in the phenomenal character of our certain experiences could affect the preferences of the agent. In Paul's example, you can know that your preferences will change, but you don't have first-person access to the way they'll change. This affects the way you think about the choice. You can know on the basis of testimony of others how your preferences will change when you become a vampire. For instance, you may know Everybody you know may already become a vampire, and they may tell you that they love it. They might even tell you that if you were offered a pill to become human again, they would reject the offer without a moment's thought. Despite having all this information, you still won't know what it's like to be a vampire, since you can only come to know what it's like to be a vampire by becoming one. Thus, since you lack access to the phenomenal character of a vampire's lived experiences, you lack access to certain concepts, pieces of information, or cognitive skills necessary for understanding why the preferences that come with vampire are rational to maintain, or at least make sense to have for someone who's a vampire. The case is intended to illustrate ways in which the radical changes in phenomenal character can lead to changes in the very core of our personality, since the beliefs, desires, and commitments that make us who we are can be shaped by what it's like to be us. Certain types of radical changes in our phenomenal character of our lived experience can personally transform us. Our focus in this chapter is this latter point, on the way in which radical changes in lived experiences can lead to changes in who we are. Let an epistemically transformative act be an act that brings about an epistemically transformative experience. Let a personally transformative act be an act that brings about a personally transformative experience. Two features of personally transformative acts are worth getting clear on. First, of all acts that are epistemically and personally transformative, raise problems for theories of practical rationality. These problems are not our concern here. In what follows, we'll focus exclusively on personally transformative acts without addressing the question of whether and how they are also epistemically transformative acts, or how epistemic transformation relates to practical decision-making. Second, some personally transformative acts may be preceded by a moment of conscious choice where the relevant agent decides to perform that act, but that may not always be the case. In particular, some transformative acts are not the product of conscious choice, or as Kallard correctly observes, sometimes we gradually transform our personalities without ever directly deciding to undergo the transformation. Yet that doesn't mean that we are thoughtlessly drifting into these new personalities. Rather, in many cases, for example, in the case where one becomes a mother, an artist, a lover of classical music, etc., one actively tries on new roles or experiences which enable one to navigate the world using a new set of beliefs and preferences, or to experience the world in a new way. On Kallard's account, we can aspire to rational self-transformation by aiming at it indirectly, guided by proleptic reasons. Our notion of a personally transformative act covers these sorts of cases, unchosen or unconsciously chosen, aspirational. Since the agent could still have preferences about such acts, whether or not they guide our actions, her act of undertaking the project counts as a personally transformative act, even if the act never explicitly, if the agent never explicitly decided to perform a personally transformative act. And the count is up to something. In this section, we defend the following claim: the principle of act dependence. If an agent performs a personally transformative act, then keeping all else fixed, she thereby creates a new self. Okay, we're gonna finish reading this and then maybe put this in Hypernomicon. Creates a new self that wouldn't have existed if she hadn't performed the transformative act. To understand what this means, start with the notion of a self that the principle invokes. For the purpose of the chapter, we'll assume an agent self of a person at a certain time is constituted by the core beliefs, core values, beliefs, desires, commitments, ideals, character traits, etc. that make her who she is at the time, including the first-person phenomenology that's realized by having these core values, etc. Now, change in these needs to be dramatic that we're no longer inclined to think that person who existed before the change exists anymore. For instance, Sue may take a college course that changes her world very radically, thus changing her plans about what to do with her life. But that needn't mean that the person that Sue was before taking the college course has ceased to exist. Possibly that person still exists, but she's no longer exactly who she was earlier. On this way of thinking, a person's life may be partitioned into intervals corresponding to a series of successive selves, which in turn are suitably extended collections of temporal parts. Here's a more careful definition for a person S. Temporal part X invests that exists during an interval of time T counts as self if and only if 1. Prudential status. X is prudential status, that is, its well-being can be an object of prudential concern for that and other temporal parts of F's. 1. Worry about views like this is that assigning temporal parts of a person prudential and moral status makes it difficult to explain why practical rationality and morality seems to require a temporal part of a person to subject itself to a small harm to protect a future temporal part from greater harm. For the latter temporal parts, good fortune doesn't really compensate the earlier part for the harm that's subjected to. See Miller and Johnson for different versions of this worry. What are these? Prudence in person stages. The personality problem. Have I read more? Let's download prudence and person stages real fast. I might already have it downloaded, waiting to read, but cited by 4. Oh, it's downloaded. I downloaded it back in September of last year. They've read everything that's citing it. And the personality problem I already have ready to go. Is Kaiserman forthcoming correctly now? Such problems arise only for stage theoretic, something of predominatism. Stage theory, the personality problem. Great. Forthcoming. Constancy. As the self-identity conferring mental states remain unchanged during T, that is, during any two subintervals T1 and T2 of T, the mental states that make S who she is at T1 are the same as those who make her who she is at T2. Maximality, there's no interval of time T star during which S exists such that T star is distinct from T. T is a subinterval of T star, and as the self-identity confirmed mental states remain relatively unchanged during T star. What does that mean? Let's explore this, but start with the idea of a temporal part of a person. If Sue is a person who's now in her 40s, Sue in her 20s is a temporal part of Sue. Why should we think that persons have such temporal parts? It follows from a view about persistence. According to endurance, objects persist through time by being wholly present at each moment at which they exist. Maybe we can now... This is 4-dimensional somewhere, 3-dimensional. Okay, whatever. According to Perduratists, they exist by having temporal parts that are wholly present at each moment in which they exist. More precisely, that object X be an instantaneous temporal part of an object Y at T, if and only if X exists at but only at time T, and X is a part of Y at T. X overlaps at T everything that's part of Y at T. I missed footnote, or endnote 6. That's right here. Note the notion of self is importantly different from the notion that Parfit proposes a shoemaker defends. For Parfit, cells or person stages united by strong psychological connectedness, i.e., e.g. direct memory connection. Since relation is a strong psychological connectedness, not transitive, a person at a certain time may have two different overlapping selves, two different selves that overlap with each other. Right. However, in our view, selves don't overlap with each other. Our conception is closer to the view defended by Christensen, Strominger, and Nichols, on which certainly morally accessible beliefs, desires, dispositions, etc. of an agent constitute self. However, for the sake of avoiding confusion, it's worth pointing out that Strominger and Nichols use the term self and person interchangeably, which we don't. Christensen, Strominger, and Nichols. I haven't read it. The essential moral self. Interesting. It's short, too. Whoop. Perduratists just say that for any object X persists if T is a time at which X exists, there's an instantaneous temporal part of X at T, and Duratists deny this. To take a concrete case, suppose your desk has persisted through time. Perduratists would say that it's done so by having instantaneous temporal parts at every moment in which it existed, and Duratists would say that it's persisted by being wholly present in these moments at which it has existed. Similarly, if Sue has persisted through time, then according to Perduratist, she too has done so by having instantaneous temporal parts at every moment at which she's existed, and Duratists would deny this. Perdurantism is preferable to endurantism as it accounts for objective persistence. For the former allows us to respond to certain puzzles satisfactorily. For an account of the subjective persistence of selves that's consistent with this approach, see Paul 2017. The subjectively enduring self. Typically, Perduratists claim that the persons and material objects do not just have instantaneous temporal parts, but also have temporal parts that themselves are extended temporally. The most liberal version of this view would be the one according to which the person or material object has temporal parts corresponding to any period of time in which he exists. This would just mean that Sue in her 20s counts as a temporal part of Sue, so does Sue in October 2018 or Sue at this moment. For the purposes of this chapter, we'll take a temporal part of the person to count as itself, just in case it satisfies 3 constraints. The first is prudential status. This is these things. A self for its well-being can be the object of prudential concern for that person or other temporal parts of that person. This seems plausible. The well-being of different temporal parts of a person can be the object of prudential concern for this person. In fact, some people might say something even stronger, namely that all instantaneous temporal parts of a person ought to be objects of equal prudential concern for that person. It's worth addressing a worry here, saying the self's prudential status doesn't commit us to a view in which the separateness of persons doesn't matter in prudential reasoning. For Brink, the assumption that persons are metaphysically separate units allows us to preserve the hybrid structure of prudence, which permits an agent to be biased in favor of himself, but doesn't permit him to be biased in favor of any of her temporal parts. As Brink 2011 acknowledges, the fact that an agent is required to be by rationality, not to be biased in favor of any of her temporal parts, only motivates the requirement of temporal impartiality, the requirement that an agent should have equal concern for parts, and not the stronger requirement of temporal neutrality, i.e. the view that agent should attach equal weight to the well-being of her temporal parts. Even though Brink defends the latter requirement in a number of places, we think it's plausible, at least some problems in the totalist theory of prudence leads to. If only the requirement of temporal partiality is true, then there remains a non-trivial question for theories of prudence to settle, that is the question of how to distribute benefits. What just happened to my screen? Everything went black. Now it's back. Oh, I lost my third monitor. The question of how to distribute benefits and harms across different temporal parts of the same person. So prudential reasoning is concerned with this question of distribution, that it can indeed be right to say that different temporal parts of an agent that itself can be objects of prudential concern. What is Brink 1997? That's what I thought. Just had to be sure. Second feature is constancy. If T is a period of time during which a self exists, the agent's identity conferring mental states, the mental states that make her who she is cannot change. We may imagine a fictional case where a person changes their mental states at T1 so that immediately after T1 she's no longer who she was before T1, but then in T2 she reverts back to her old mental states before T1. In such cases, the same self doesn't persist through the continuous interval of time. That includes the time before T1 as well as after T2. Okay, I mean, we'll see where they go with this. I'm not buying it so far. The third feature is maximality. The self is the largest temporal part of a person unified by sameness with respect to who she is. Here's a way of illustrating this. Suppose Sue doesn't undergo any personal transformations in her 30s. Who she is at 31 is no different from who she is at 32 or 33 and so on. According to maximality, this means that Sue at 31, Sue at 32, Sue at 33, etc. are parts of the same self, but aren't selves of their own right. That's because Sue at 31 exists during an interval of time that is a non-empty intersection with larger interval of time, namely the period during which Sue in her 30s exists, and Sue's self-identity during her 30s isn't different from her self-identity at 31. How does this help us with the principle of active-dependence? We'll assume that a person S at 2 times T and T star is realized by the same temporally extended self, if and only if the self that realizes her at T is no different from the self that realizes her at T star. We are interested in cases where, in virtue of S performing a transformative act at T, a new self comes into existence at T star. Such cases are those where, when we hold relevant background conditions fixed, in particular, for simplicity, we're ruling out the possibility of overdetermination or preemption in transformative self-creation. For a discussion of problems with preemption and overdetermination, for reductive accounts of dependency, Paul and Hull. We are helping ourselves with this simplification since we're interested in formulating a puzzle as it relates to Parkin's identity problem, not giving a full non-identity, probably. We're not giving a fully reductive independent account of transformative self-creation. The following counterfactual is true. If at time T, S hadn't performed that transformative act, then the new self would not have been created at T star. By extension, we assume that if the act had not been performed, the same self that realizes S at T star would persist from T to T star. So if we're focusing on acts for which the principle of act dependence holds, on cases for which the principle of act dependence holds, Parfit's version of the non-identity problem is motivated by 2 plausible claims. One, the person infecting principle. That can be morally wrong. I'll make that make sense. Let's put the person at defecting principle here. comparative notion of harm for persons. Suppose an act or an event brings a person into existence such that 1. The person couldn't have existed in the absence of the act. 2. The person's existence is avoidably flawed. And 3. The person's existence is still worth having for that person. Then this act or event doesn't make things worse for that person. Here we are working with the notion of harm, according to which harming a person or herself involves making things for it. Presently worse for it. If we adopt a non-comparative notion of harm, we may reject this view. For example, C should for N. However, we can form another version of the same puzzle by substituting every occurrence that make things worse with harm. Notice, however, that she will reject the relevant version of comparative notion of harm for persons because she thinks that inflicting harm to confer a pure benefit is morally wrong unless the subject of the harm consents to it. But her view has the implausible consequences that even when a person's life goes extremely well, but involves some unavoidable harm, even then it's morally impermissible to bring that person into existence, right? Because she's an anti-natalist. We can apply these two principles to the following scenario. 14-year-old girl. The girl chooses to have a child. Because she's so young, she gives her child a bad start in life. Though this will have bad effects throughout the child's life, his life will predictably be worth living. If this girl had waited for several years, she would have had a different child, to whom she would have given a better start in life. The intuition is supposed to be that the girl makes the morally wrong decision. How do we explain this? According to the person-affecting principle, this can be true only if her act makes things worse for her or harms the child. According to the comparative notion of harm, the girl's act doesn't make things worse for her or harm the child. If the girl had waited, if a different child would have been born, the child's life, despite its flaws, is still worth living. So either we must give up the intuition that the girl does something wrong, or we must give up the comparative notion of harm, or the person-affecting principle. We can create a similar problem with respect to transformative acts. Let's start with two principles. First is the analog of person-affecting principle. The self-affecting principle, an agent can rationally prefer not to perform an available act A only if there exists. There are lots of typos in this book. Only if there exists an available act B and a current or possible future self X of the agent such that the expected well-being of X conditional on the agent performing B is greater than the expected well-being of X conditional on the agent's performing A. Here and everywhere else, the expected well-being or harm or any other kind of value is calculated according to a credence function that's rational for the agent to currently adopt. Don't think you need that, but whatever. I mean, this is false, but I'll keep reading. Consider the following pair of cases. Surgery 1, on Monday you have to schedule surgery to have your wisdom teeth removed, painfully but safely under a week local anesthetic. You're certain about the following facts. There are two surgeons who can perform the surgery. The surgery will begin exactly the same time no matter who performs it, but the first surgery will take more time to perform the operation, so you'll be in pain for a longer time. Who will you pick as your surgeon? On Monday you have to surgery 2. On Monday you have to schedule a surgery to have your wisdom teeth removed, painfully but safely under a week local anesthetic. You're certain about the following facts. There are two surgeons who can perform the surgery. The surgeon will begin exactly the same time no matter who performs it. Moreover, both surgeons will take exactly the same amount of time to perform the operation. Whom will you pick as your surgeon? If you're rational in surgery 1, you will prefer not to pick the first surgeon, but in surgery 2, you'll remain indifferent between the two. The self-affecting principle explains why. Since you know the first surgeon in surgery 1 will subject you to pain for a longer period of time, you know that in surgery 1, there's at least one existing or future self that will be made worse off the first surgeon. By contrast, you know in surgery 2, things won't be better or worse for your present or future selves, neither is the scenarios. That's why it's irrational for you to prefer one surgeon to another. Second principle is an analog comparative notion of harm for persons, comparative notion of harm for selves. Suppose an act or event wouldn't result in the existence of, suppose an act or event results in the existence of future self, such that one, the future self wouldn't have existed in the absence of the self of the act or event. The future self's existence is unavoidably flawed, and the future self's existence is still worth having for that future self. Then this act or event doesn't make things worse for that future self. Here's a way of motivating this principle. Many disabled people report that from their own first personal perspective, they don't experience their disabilities a harm, since despite its challenges, the disability doesn't make their lives unworthy of having, and if they didn't have that disability, they wouldn't be who they actually are. For discussion, see blah blah blah. Here's a revealing passage from Nilanjan who writes, I can't count how many times I've been asked the variation of the question if there's a pill that could cure your disability, would you take it? But the short answer is there's that no. I rarely get the chance to elaborate on the complex feelings and emotions that are behind My answer: I think cure is actually a rather loaded term in relation to my disability, because to cure something implies that you return the body to its normal state. My disability is my normal state. To cure me in accordance with the medical definition of the word would not only give me new abilities, but also essentially transform me into a whole new person. I can't imagine myself as an able-bodied person because I've never been an able-bodied person. I've embraced my disability as a huge facet of my identity, and I take pride in it. While I don't define myself solely by my disability, having a disability is undeniably shaped who I am. Without my lived experience as a disabled person, I would be completely different Emily, and as tough as certain aspects of my life has been, and though I know I'll continue to face disability-related challenges throughout my life, I wouldn't trade my life for a minute. My disability has given me a place in the community and a culture. It's been a reason why I've had amazing adventures and unforgettable experiences, and to freely walk up and down stairs for one day would never measure up to things I've done because I have a disability. Building on this idea, we can create a case like this. Disability 1. Suppose you went blind as a child because of an accident. Since then, your blindness has given you the benefit of certain valuable experiences that a sighted person wouldn't be able to have. For example, you hear and feel things that sighted individuals fail to notice. You experience the world differently and discover new ways to relate to your environment. It's also allowed you to become part of a community and culture which sighted people did not have access to, and you know that if the accident hadn't happened and you retained your sight, you wouldn't have enjoyed those experiences or formed the close relationships with other members of the blind community, which would shape the way you see yourself in every rich your life. Thus, you come to see your own blindness as a blessing in disguise. In this case, Liddell puts it: perhaps you wouldn't trade your life for the life of your non-disabled counterpart who is somehow avoid the accident. That is, the self you are now that you are would not trade itself in for a new self. From your selfish perspective, your disabled life, despite challenges, is fulfilling and is not to be traded for a scenario where you don't exist at all. Unless we want to treat the selves realized by disabled people as irrational, we should grant this preference as rational. Moreover, as Barnes convincingly argued, we have very little reason to think that this is just some sort of adaptive preference or self-deception that doesn't reflect actual quality of life. So, assuming that your preference does provide evidence for your well-being, we should conclude that your life as a disabled self is clearly worth living. Moreover, since you see your disability as a blessing in disguise and therefore don't experience it as a harm, this suggests that the self that you are now wasn't harmed by the accident, and this lends plausibly to the comparative notion of harm for selves. Harman argues that the preferences expressed by disabled people in those cases are strongly person-affecting. They are happy with their disabled lives and don't identify with the people they would have been had they not been disabled, but such preferences, according to Harman, shouldn't give us reason to think that their lives are just as good as those of non-disabled counterparts. Even if Harman is right that the life of a non-disabled person is overall better than the life of a disabled person, it can still remain true that disability in question doesn't harm the disabled person, given that she wouldn't exist without the disability. There's no clear sense in which she would have been better off without a disability. I'm very confused about this topic selves. If it's not a numerical identity, but surely it can't be a numerical identity. The problem: you learn from your doctor you'll become blind soon if you don't undergo cataract surgery. If you ever become blind, there wouldn't be any serious transition costs. Fortunately, your family is extremely supportive. You live in a society that doesn't treat blind people as well, but differently from the sighted. However, you will inescapably lose certain capacities. You won't be able to read very many books, you won't be able to paint, and you won't be able to play the sport you love the most. At the same time, your blindness will allow you to have certain experiences a sighted person can have, and it will give you a place within a community and culture that sighted people don't have access to. Finally, you're certain that your blindness will eventually change. How you see yourself, your identity will at least be partly shaped by your blindness, and you'll be glad that you became blind. If you choose not to have cataract surgery, you'll be performing a transformative act. You'll be radically changing who you are. According to the principle act dependence, then your decision to go blind would bring into existence future self-views that wouldn't exist if you chose to have the surgery. From the perspective of your current self, the lived experience of the future self is unavoidably flawed. Yet at the same time, there's no reason to think that the life of your blind self wouldn't be worth saving. We'll keep reading. Wouldn't be worth having. Here's the problem. On the one hand, it seems tempting in this case to say that you can rationally prefer the act of undergoing cataract surgery to doing nothing. You know that you won't be able to do lots of things you currently care about, enjoy, and excel at, your ability to play certain sports, paint, read lots of books, etc. On the other hand, this claim is incompatible with the conjunction of the self-affecting principle for selves and the comparative notion of harm for selves. According to the self-affecting principle, you can rationally prefer not to perform an act A only if there is another available act that's expected to make one of your present or future selves better than A does. This means that the act maximizes the well-being of your current and future selves. It's rationally impermissible for you not to prefer that act. But in this case, your blind future self would exist if you underwent cataract surgery. Since the self's existence is worth having according to the comparative notion of harm for selves, not having surgery doesn't harm your blind future self or make it worse off. Therefore, it's indeed irrational for you to prefer undergoing the surgery. It's irrational for you to prefer undergoing the surgery to not undergoing the surgery. In fact, you should be indifferent between the two options. The upshot is this: if we accept the principle of act dependence, either we have to reject the intuition that's practically rational for you to prefer to undergo the surgery in this case, or we have to give up one of the two principles we introduced. In this respect, the problem is a structure that's exactly analogous to the non-identity problem. I suppose we should put this into hypernomicon. Although they're gonna talk a bit more. It's worth noting how the problem of transformative choice is different from other problems raised by scenario transformative choice. Two such problems ought to be mentioned. First of all, Paul argues that epistemically transformative experiences reveal a problem for standard decision theory. Consider an epistemically transformative experience like tasting the durian fruit for the first time. That was not epistemically transformative for me, because I could sort of, you can tell what it's going to taste like by smelling it. Consider if the agent is given the choice of undergoing such an experience, can it be practically irrational for her to take it? Paul's claim is that since an agent can't know what the experience will be like before undergoing the experience itself, she cannot accurately assign the subjective value to the problem where she undergoes that experience, but the standard decision theory, which requires us to maximize expected value of some kind, can help us generate and ordering preferences over options only if we can assign values to the different outcomes of taking each option. So standard decision theory is silent on cases like this. Subsequent discussion, blah, blah, blah. Personally transformative experiences, e.g. the experience of having a child, give rise to a different problem, practical decision-making contexts that can change the way an agent's core values and preferences in unforeseen ways. Writing about the transformative choice of becoming a vampire, Paul says, so until you actually become a vampire, you cannot know if the values of any relevant outcomes will swamp the rest. Or how to compare the subjective value of being a vampire to the subjective value of being a human, or which preferences about the outcomes that you have as a vampire will be the same as the preferences you have. As a human, the idea is this: when the agent makes a decision, she makes the decision on behalf of her current as well as her future selves, but if the agent can't accurately forecast the preferences of her future selves after performing an act, then she can't take those preferences into account when making her decision. This problem should be distinguished by a different problem that doesn't depend on ignorance in the same way, namely the problem of making decisions in scenarios where the agent's values change over time. For a discussion of the problems raised by policy, Briggs and Pegger. This is probably like choosing for changing themselves or whatever. Transformative. Yeah, choosing for changing self. The problem we're concerned with does depend on our agent's prior ignorance about what experiences she'll undergo as a result of a transformative act or what her future preferences or values will be. As noted in Section 1, our focus is on a different issue: the way that radical changes in lived experience can create a new self. It's a problem simply about which selves will exist as a result of an agent's transformative act. For instance, in Disability 2, we can assume that the agent somehow, by feat of imagination or blindness simulator, has full access to what it will be like, what it will be like to be the blind self, or what values and preferences of the self will be. Still, the problem we raise will persist as long as the current self believes that the existence of her blind self is unavoidably flawed due to the lack of certain abilities that only side of the possessor would be rational for her current self to prefer undergoing the cataract surgery, not to undergo the surgery, and yet given that her future blind self existence is worth having, it'll be hard to say that the undergoing the cataract surgery is bad for her and her future blind self. This is not a non-identity problem fundamentally. This is just a problem about making decisions when your preferences change. This whole self stuff is a layer on top that just adds complexity that doesn't mean anything, right? Like, say I can just take a pill that makes me like strawberries. And right now I hate strawberries. Do I have reason to take the pill? So I think to put this into Hypernomicon, we're sticking the self stuff just in the work. That was all. If only there was a way for PDFs to bring along their italics. The technology, sadly, is beyond us. I don't like it. Constancy. Is this self thing even? I don't. I think actually given one. No, actually all the action is here. What is a self-identity conferring mental state? The mental states that make her who she is. A new self. This. What does that even mean? There are no new selves, except for a numerically distinct one. Anyways, we should put the personal non-identity, whatever, blah, blah, blah thing in here. This is in... Let's put it under the non-identity problem, and let's call it, what did they call it? Does this have a name? I don't know. It doesn't really matter what we call it because this is not cool. We'll call it the transformative. Okay, and the two things we need to accept are this and this. And I'm not even going to bother with the italics here. That is the structure of the problem, according to them. And I would like to use the restroom, so this is not 10 seconds though. This will be and I'm not even going to mute myself because I'd forget to unmute myself, so we're going to turn off the camera though. I return. Let's look at the possible responses. But first, footnote 17. Initially tempting response to the problem. If psychological continuity is what matters for survival, then we might think that person cannot survive her personal transformations, at least if her core beliefs, desires, commitments, etc. attract psychological continuity. Parfit's example of 19th century Russian nobleman seems like a good example of this, since it's rationally permissible for a person not to prefer her own death. It's rationally permissible for her not to perform a personally transformed act. Two responses. First, we've already argued that a person can survive personal transformations. Second, even if this diagnosis were plausible in some cases, it doesn't generalize well. It seems overly strong to claim that a person who's thinking of having a child or personally transformative experiences contemplating death, or consider examples where a personally transformative act brings a gradual transformation. A person who exists at any stage of such a transformation may be strongly psychologically connected with a person who existed at any immediately preceding stage of that transformation, making the person who exists before the transformative act psychologically continuous with the one after the transformation is complete. Such a case shouldn't therefore be treated as a death in either case. Thanks to Joe Horton for discussion. Denying the intuition. The first response is to reject the intuition that it's rational for the agent to pervert that she not go blind. If you are convinced by a somewhat natural example described earlier, consider a variant of the same case. Your ophthalmologist gives you two options. She could either painlessly blind you, or you can retain your imperfect but well-functioning vision. The rest remains the same as in disability 2. Here, it certainly seems rational for you to prefer not to be blinded by your ophthalmologist. Speak for yourself. But note that this isn't at all different from... Okay, just, imagine your ophthalmologist gives you two options. She could either give you a grape lollipop or she could give you a strawberry lollipop. Here, it seems rational for you to prefer the grape lollipop. No, it seems like they're on a par, and as is the case by hypothesis with this. So, of course, deny the intuition. Anyways, but let's keep going. This is not at all different from disability 2. Just as you have two options in this scenario, so you also have two options in this case, either go blind or not do. The consequences of these two options are the same in these two cases. If it's rational for you to just prefer blindness in this case, it should be rational for you to just prefer blindness in disability 2. However, someone who rejects the intuition that's rational for you to just prefer blindness in disability 2 may still reject the same intuition with respect to disability 3. Then we offer the following error theory. We're conditioned to believe that disability is intrinsically bad. That is bad not only because of the social disadvantages it gives rise to, but bad in itself. This belief is what explains our intuitions, but this belief is false. It's connected to error theory that Barnes describes in relation to Parkinson's handicapped child case, but the problem we're raising doesn't, strictly speaking, have anything to do with disability, so consider another example. Procreation. If you have children, you'll realize in yourself, your love for your children will change who you are. At the same time, your financial situation will deteriorate. As a result, you have to work longer hours, eat less healthy food, and will have much less time for your hobbies or pastimes that make your life slightly more exciting. Your life as a parent, despite being worse than your previous life, will be full of valuable experiences that make life worth having. It's analogous to disability 1 and 2. On the one hand, we may be tempted to say that's rational for you to really prefer not to have children in this scenario. Who says that? I think when we say this, what we just mean is that your life would be worse if you have children. That's plausible. But if it's by hypothesis not true, then no, it's not rational. On the other hand, this claim is incompatible with the conjunction of self-affecting principle and the comparative notion of harm. According to self-affecting principle, you prefer not to perform an act A only if it makes one of your present or future selves worse off or harms them. This means that an act that maximizes your well-being of your present and future selves is rationally permissible for you to prefer that act, but the future self that comes into being when you have children would exist if you didn't have children. Moreover, its existence worth having. So, according to the comparative notion of harm, refer to yourself in the scenario where you perform the transformative act isn't worse off and isn't harm. Therefore, it cannot be rational for you to prefer not to have children in this case. There might be a different error theory we could appeal to. Error theory 2 explains our intuitions with respect to disability 2 and 3 is kind of a rational status quo bias. That's, I think, a pretty good answer. Preference for the current affairs of to continue. This error theory is slightly more plausible than the previous one. It can explain why it seems rational for the blind person in disability 1 for not to undergo the cataract surgery and gain sight. Foster Manor to offer an error theory of this sort to explain why it seems wrong to enhance human intelligence by genetic engineering for related discussion of the rationality of status quo bias. See Neville. Some of our discussion is based on things Neville says. What's up with Neville? I wonder if I read this at one point. It sounds kind of familiar. I'm just going to download it and put it in the miscellaneous to read folder, which will never get read because I always have more pressing things to read. general strategy behind this error theory is to maintain that what makes such preferences seem rational to us is that we irrationally prefer the current state of affairs continue as it is and take ourselves to be rational to do so. However, this isn't entirely obvious. Following perfect, we may distinguish two kinds of views about rationality preferences according to objective theories or reasons to prefer one outcome to another ultimately depend on features of those outcomes. According to subjective theories, we have no reason for preferences except in a derivative case where we prefer one outcome to another because the former helps fulfill some other preferences we have. Now, if we hold a subjective view about the rationality of preferences, then in a case like disability 2, a status quo bias may indeed be rational. After all, you might attach greater value to a situation where you retain your sight and are thus able to continue the activities that you currently value than to a situation where you lose your eyesight and are thus unable to continue those activities. If we are subjectivists, we cannot dismiss such preferences as irrational. Perhaps there's room for rejecting this response. For example, the subjectivist about the rationality of preferences could impose a diachronic constraint whereby an agent is required to take into account the values and preferences of her future selves the values and preferences of her future selves into account while making her decisions. So in disability 2, given that the agent's future blind self is brought into existence will prefer its existence to its non-existence, the agent's current self might have some reason to prefer that future self exists. This response doesn't immediately convince us. We need to know more about what this diachronic constraint is. First, suppose the diachronic constraint is some sort of glad I did it principle. If an agent is rationally certain that she'll perform an act, she'll be rationally glad that she did it, then she is rationally required. Then she's required by rationality to prefer to perform that act. This principle is Harman is convinced the argument is questionable, especially in the kinds of cases we're discussing. What does Harman say? I haven't read that. Whatever. Saying besides, also these say inconsistent verdicts. Suppose. Maybe. What? Suppose the relevant diachronic constraint is some kind of linear pooling principle, namely the expected value of an act which partially determines the agent's preferences about it must be calculated in light of a value function that's formed by aggregating in a value function of the agent's present self and future selves that will come to exist if the agent performs the relevant act. This principle is more plausible as pedigree shows. If an agent doesn't conform to such constraint, it should be predictably exploitable, but this account fails to make any concrete predictions about disability 2, depending on the weight when each value function gets, it could be rational for the agent to continue to prefer that she retain her sight, so the challenge for the opponent would be coming up with the appropriate method of aggregation that predicts this preference isn't rational. I don't know, I just, declare by fiat this works, because that's, all we're trying to do is make sense of our intuitions, and as long as we have an account that makes sense of the intuitions, as long as we put the weights right, then just put the weights like that. Or put the weights however you want. I don't understand. Suppose we're objectivists about the rationality of preferences. Even then, it's not obvious why we couldn't vindicate the rationality of preferences in disability 2. According to the description of disability 2, your blind self is worse off than your possible sighted future self, allowed to certain capacities that the former lacks. These capacities, on an objective view, may contribute to the well-being of the sighted self to an extent that cannot be compensated by the other benefits the blind self could receive. If this description of the case is correct, the blind self, even though its existence was worth having, may indeed be worse off than the sighted self. If the choice is between a situation where your future self is better off and a situation where your future self is worse off, that does seem rational to prefer that you retain your eyesight. In this case, it doesn't seem obviously like a rational case of status quo bias, but this is not taking the disability stuff seriously. The disability literature, not the disability itself. It's taking the disability itself too seriously. Denying the comparative notion of harm for selves. Another strategy involves denying the comparative notion of harm for selves. Someone who adopts this strategy would have to say that in a case like disability 1, the disabled self, the agent is genuinely harmed by her accident, even though she is in a position to recognize that harm herself. Okay, whatever. First of all, a response to this sort is only available to the person who objects some form of welfare objectivism. Welfare objectivism is the view that there's a certain thing or certain things, a set of freedoms, functions, capabilities, basic list of goods, etc., that constitute a good life, independent of whether these things are desired by the particular person who lives the relevant life or can be said to be happy without them. The person who wishes to say that you, as you exist years after your accident and disability 1, are in fact harmed by your accident, cannot accept the theory of welfare, in which welfare is a matter of happiness or desire satisfaction. For all your actual or suitably idealized preferences may indeed be satisfied in this case, and you can reasonably be called happy. No, because you have some preferences that you had before you got disabled, not to get disabled. However, welfare objectivism isn't sufficient for us to deny that the comparative notion of harm for selves. What we need is a notion of harm in which even though your later self couldn't be better off in disability 1, that is a case in which the accident that disables you still harms your later self, insofar as it deprives your later self of certain freedom, capabilities, or functions. Perhaps a defender of this position can come up with a list of goods such that an act or event prevents the agent from possessing certain items on the list at certain times, and then the self that exists at the time is harmed. The problem is this: even if we could come up with a list like that, an agent who finds herself in a situation of transformative choice would not necessarily know what the list of goods is, or which items on the list are such are lacking them that would constitute harm. For instance, in disability 2, if you rationally take the testimony of disabled people seriously, as you should, you might be rationally extremely confident that the disability doesn't actually constitute harm, despite your light the expected harm that disability causes to your present or future selves may indeed be negligible, therefore occurring the self-effective principle. You cannot rationally prefer to undergo the cataract surgery for the expected harm that the going blind poses more than expected harm caused by the... Yeah, I mean, this just shows that it's not a problem. This in turn will conflict with the intuition that it's rational. Right, yeah, so the intuition goes bye-bye. Thus, even if the comparative notion of harm for self is false, the problem that we saw in disability 2 can be raised here again. Denying the self-affecting principle. This discussion makes salient the different strategy for solving the problem, rejecting the self-affecting principle. I mean, isn't that principle just obviously false? Yeah. According to the principle, an agent can be rational. Oh, look, it's right here too. A, only if in comparison with other available acts, performing A is expected to make things worse. 4, harms our present self or whatever future selves. However, there are alternative plausible theories of prudence that are incompatible with this theory. Start with the following simple theory. Presence theory of prudence. It's rationally permissible for an A to prefer an act. Available act is rational for an agent to prefer an available act A to an available act B, if and only if the expected well-being of the agent's self conditional on her performing A is greater than the expected well-being of the agent's current self. Conditional on her performing B. I don't know about that, but okay. It's unclear whether what the theory entails in a case like disability B. In that scenario where there are 2 acts available to the agent, going blind or not going blind, while it's clear these acts affects the agent's future self, it's unclear whether they'll affect the well-being of the agent's current self. At least it seems coherent to say they won't affect the agent's current well-being at all, so this version of the present theory won't do at all. We might replace it with this. It's actually permissible to an agent to prefer an available A to an available act B, if and only if the expected value of A is greater than the expected value of B, where the value of the difference in outcomes of A and B is fixed by the agent's current actual preferences. Okay, well, it's substantially different from the previous presentist theory, since it appeals not the well-being of any agent's current self, but rather the actual preferences of the agent's current self. It might solve the problem that we're dealing with in disability 2. You might already have preferences about blindness. You might prefer to actually prefer to have sight to going blind. Given these preferences, undergoing the cataract surgery would indeed maximize the expected value, but note that the solution won't always work. What if you haven't given the matter of going blind any thought at all? In such a scenario, you may not have preference either way, so no value can be assigned to different outcomes by the available acts. As a result, the expected value of the option will be undefined. This theory is terrible. In other words, to consider a case of future discounting, I've been given the option of undergoing painful surgery under week level anesthetic either tomorrow or in a month. If I undergo the surgery in a month, it'll last an hour. If I go tomorrow, it'll last an hour. If I undergo it in a month, it'll last 4 hours, and pain will be 4 times as much. In this scenario, it seems irrational for me to prefer to undergo the surgery in a month, but if I'm a future discounter, I actually want pain to be further away in the future than nearby, then given my current preferences, the presentist theory of prudence could entail it's rationally permissible for me to prefer to undergo the surgery in a month. That seems bad, or at least more defensive with the master issue. Moreover, since we cannot solve the problem of value gap, we cannot solve the problem of value gap by appealing to rational preferences. Since the theory is supposed to predict what your preferences about going blind, not going blind should be, the theory cannot generate this prediction by appealing back to your rational preferences about going blind, not going blind. Doing so would make the theory circular. Correct. What this shows is that the problem can't be solved by appealing to an agent's current well-being or preferences. We might hope that this can be solved by a theory of prudence that takes into account the agent's future well-being or preferences. Consider the following theory of prudence. Solve this theory of prudence. It's rationally permissible for an agent to prefer an available act A to an available act B, if and only if the expected net well-being of the agent's possible current and future selves, conditional on her performing A, is greater than the expected net well-being of the agent's possible current and future selves, conditional on her performing B. Sounds decent. Version of the total list theory only takes into account the well-being of the agent's future selves. We can offer a preference-based analog of the theory. Rationally permissible for an agent to prefer an act A to B, if and only if the expected value of A is greater than the expected value of B, where the value of any outcome A or B is just the sum of the different values assigned by the agent's current and future selves. The outcome, if the agent's preferences over outcomes can be represented as cardinal utilities, this proposal can work. However, this proposal may raise interpersonal Now, analogs of the problem of interpersonal utility comparisons more will be subject to the same problem that the totalist theory of prudence is subject to. And the problem with that is, we can see how this theory easily takes care of cases like disability 2 in preparation. In these situations, the agent has no uncertainty. She knows exactly what will happen if she takes any of her options. In disability 2, she knows that if she goes blind, she'll bring into existence a future self, which will be worse off in comparison to the future self. In comparison with the future self that exists if she undergoes the surgery, so given the net well-being of the possible current future self, possible current and future selves that will exist if she undergoes a cataract surgery is greater than the net well-being of those selves that will exist if she doesn't undergo the surgery. It's rationally permissible for the agent to undergo the surgery in this case. Similar diagnosis will allow us to progress to preparation. However, this view faces the same problem that totalist theories that its versions of utilitarianism face population ethics, namely the repugnant conclusion. Consider the following case. You're 25 now, relatively good health. Bad news is that you've been diagnosed with life-threatening illness. There are 2 pills available to you. Pill A will allow you to live for 25 years in roughly the same physical conditions you're now in, but if you take pill B, your health will deteriorate rapidly and you'll be bedridden for the remainder of your life, but you'll be able to live 60 more years and your existence will be worth having. Suppose you undergo personal transformations every year. Your self will change for every year for the rest of your life. You know this. You know that taking pill B will diminish your animal well-being exactly half in comparison to whatever the other was B, so you can rationally expect that all else being equal, the pill will the net well-being of your current and future selves conditional on your taking pill A will be K plus some f of x, where K is the well-being of your current self, and X is the well-being of each of your animal future selves, if things continue as they are now. By contrast, if you take B, your net well-being of your current and future selves will be K plus 60x over 2. According to the totalist theory of prudence, rationality requires you to prefer. Sorry, I was doing the math in my head. Rationality requires you to prefer pill B and thus be bedridden for 60 years. This seems bad. Says who? Says who? Says who? We may try to fix this problem by adopting the averages theory of prudence. It's rationally permissible for an agent to prefer an available act to an available act B if and only if the expected average value of the agent's possible current and future selves conditional on him performing A is greater than the expected average well-being of the agent's possible future current selves conditioning on her performing B. Fine, whatever. Once again, we can construct it. Yeah, I know. This will avoid the problem of pill star cases raised for totalist theory of prudence. It's the average well-being of your future selves when you take the pill B is exactly half the average well-being of your future selves when you take the pill A. The average well-being of your current and future selves in the current former scenario is greater than the average well-being of your current and future selves in the last scenario. So you're required by the averages theory of prudence to take pill A. This might seem like a solution to the problem as above. If it's the problem, you know the rest of your life will be exceptionally wonderful. Now you're off to a problem that live one more day. You're supposed to on that day. You'll be slightly worse off, but things will be quite nice. There are 2 possible situations, and one you take the drug and the other you don't. Suppose you'll undergo personal transformations every year, so your self will change every year for the rest of your life. And you know this. In the first situation, the average well-being of your current and future selves is lower. In the second, the well-being on the last day of your life is the first. Yeah, so yeah, blah, 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 blah. Challenge here is to come up with principle of prudence that satisfies the 2 disadvantages. First of all, it should allow us to bring into existence a non-existent future self that's better off in comparison with the distant non-existent self. Second, the principle should allow us to prolong human lives in cases by adding additional future selves, just because those future selves are guaranteed to have an existence with a very low level of well-being. Yet it should allow us to do when they have a relatively high degree of well-being. Similar attempts of finding similar theories have been unsuccessful in population ethics, and we expect the same problems to arise for proposed. Doubtful, but see your right answer for Let's take stock. In this chapter, we began by showing that scenarios of transformative choice can create a problem that's exactly analogous to a non-identical problem. We went on to consider 3 possible solutions to the problem and show that none of them obviously succeed. It has 2 consequences. The first, population ethics for theories of prudence. Since we've shown that there's an interpersonal analog of the non-identity problem, we suggest that the non-identity problem has nothing in particular to do with population ethics. It belongs to a more general class of problems that arise whenever an agent faces a choice of creating another agent, whether it's a self or person, whose existence would be unavoidably flawed but still worth living. Second, the discussion poses a challenge for existing theories of prudence or practical rationality. Starting theories of prudence require the practically rational agent to perform acts that maximize the expected value of some sort. Our interpersonal analog reveals a problem with almost all versions of this theory. Yeah, don't buy any of it, whatever, blah, 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 not a problem. For anybody, we're just going to save the book, close it, we're done. I don't know why it's taking a while to save. Close this, close the duplicate copy. So there's two more things I want to read. I think I want to reread this book, and my buddy sent me a Schuchtman paper that I haven't put into Hypernomicon yet. And which of those do I want to do? I might actually do neither. I might review a paper now for a journal. That's what I'm going to do. So we're done. I may stream later today when I reread like Lewis or Schuchtman. Reread Lewis, read Schuchtman. So we'll see. But for now, stop streaming. Where's the button? There's the button.